How are we doing today, folks? It's been a while since I've given you any kind of updates from country living on a shoestring out here, and I really haven't said anything about the garden since I was just plowing it early in the spring, the video I did with that. So both gardens have been in now for about a month, and everything's starting to grow. Forgive the mess that it looks tonight. We've had this day of like every hour we get a 15-minute downpour of rain. It's been very humid and thunder showery all day, so we've got this standing water and it's just a mess. I've got to get back in here next week with the tiller and take some of those weeds out again. Once we get this hot, humid weather and wet weather, the weeds just go crazy. But what I wanted to do was tell you about an experiment that I'm doing this year in the garden. This is something that I saw online. A couple different people on YouTube are doing this, and it's a technique that I can't remember the woman's name, but it was maybe 100 years ago that she invented this technique for growing some crops. And two things that were suggested to be done this way were potatoes and onions. Now typically when I've planted potatoes, what I've done is I've gone through with the tiller, loosened the soil, and then kind of dug it out a bit, went through the tiller a second time. So I sort of had a 6-inch deep trench or so to put the potatoes in, the seed potatoes in. And then you cover them back up, and then throughout the course of the summer you keep hilling up that trench so that you get this mound that's maybe, 12 inches, 15 inches high, and it's in there that the potatoes grow. The potatoes grow not all the way down at the bottom of the roots, but sort of partway down the shaft in the ground. And it's fairly labor intensive to do, and you always have weeds, and then you got the weeds growing in the in the mound too, and you got to be careful because if you pull too much of the weeds out, then you're pulling potato plants out, and it's been a little tricky, especially if you don't use pesticides or herbicides, and same thing with onions. I didn't necessarily dig the trench 6 inches deep, but I'd still dig a couple inch deep trench with the hoe or whatever, and then put the onions in and cover them over, and then they would come up eventually. And again, the same thing, you're dealing with weeds. Well, what I did here, if you look here, you can see this is where my potatoes and my onions are this year. The suggestion was this: just take and do your basic prep of your soil for your garden. So I ran the tiller through this just like I did the rest of the garden, just to bury all the growth that came up earlier in the spring and to loosen the soil. And then after that, all I did was I took a bag of potatoes, and it wasn't even really seed potatoes. It was an old bag of potatoes that my wife never got to, and I just stuck it out in the barn, and they all grew eyes. So I figured we'll give it a try. Then all I did is I put them on the ground on top of the soil. I tried to space them out a bit just so that they wouldn't be on top of each other. And then I had also gotten a bag of onions at the one farmer's market, just sweet Spanish onions. They were just in a paper bag, so all I did with them is just kind of scattered them on the ground. I wasn't so particular about making sure they were in rows or what have you. So I laid all those out. And then I got 2 bales of hay. I'd gotten a number of bales of old hay from my son. Brought a few bales over here and just began to separate the hay and shook it all out over top of the onions and the potatoes. And I had it to a depth of maybe 6-8 inches high. Just loosely put it on, but thick that it would choke out anything else that I didn't want growing. And what has happened is what's supposed to happen. The potatoes actually grow up through the hay, and as you can see here too, the onions have grown up through the hay. And the idea is if the hay is thick enough, it will choke out all the other weeds, and all you'll have is the crop that you're growing. And then when it's fully mature, all you do is you rake the hay back, and there you have the potatoes, the new growth potatoes laying on the ground, ready to be picked. You don't have to dig them, which is great because that saves a lot of time too. Same thing with the onions. Now, I'm still a ways away from being able to harvest anything, obviously, here. I'm still at the beginning of the growing season. But the way they're growing now, it looks good. As you can see, that dark green right there, that's a potato plant, and I have about, through this section, they haven't all come up, and I don't remember how many there were in the bag totally. But I have like 21, 22, and there's still a few more I think are going to pop up through the, look like they want to try to pop up through the hay. So I may get some more yet out of the deal. The hay has flattened itself out a bit just because of the rain and so on. It just has smushed down. And I do see that I do have a little bit of weed problem here. There were some places that I maybe didn't get the hay on thick enough to keep the other weeds from coming up. So it's an experiment. Tried it the first time this year. Next year maybe I'll put, if it works and I get a good harvest, I'll put thicker hay down so there's less chance of any kind of weeds growing up, and then just trust that the plants will push their way up through to the sunlight. And if you think about it, it makes perfect sense, because if you're planting your seed potatoes 6 inches underground, they got to go through 6 inches of soil to get sunlight. So what's the difference if it's soil or if it's hay? Same thing with the onions. So we'll see what happens here. I'll give you an update later in the year when I go to harvest them to show what I got. And if this turns out to be this way, this whole process, now aside from the tilling, but that was part of when I tilled the whole rest of the garden. When I did that, I didn't do anything special. I just loosened the soil enough that and got rid of any kind of vegetation growth that was there. And then all I had to do was throw the potatoes down, throw the onions down, and shake the hay on. I think the whole thing took me half hour, an hour, 45 minutes, something like that. I mean, it didn't take very long at all to do all that. Usually when I'm putting in a row of potatoes or 2 rows of potatoes, it's a couple hours worth of work till you do all the tilling, and then you make sure you have your trench dug and you put your potatoes in, and you got to close up the trench, and then you got the work of, like I said, throughout the course of the summer. Usually I'm hilling them up at least twice, if not 3 times during the course of the summer, plus all the weeding and so on. So if this eliminates all of that, and I still get a decent crop of potatoes, well, then it'll be absolutely worth it to do it this way. So I'm just sharing this with you. If this is something you'd like to try, or maybe next year, give it a try. Now, this is hay. This is not straw. You want the hay rather than the straw, because the hay will rot. The hay will provide nutrients to the soil, and it'll choke out vegetation better. Straw tends to be grass that's well, it's no longer grass, it's dead, you know. It's from the grains, whether it's rye straw or wheat straw or what have you, oat straw. It's not it has no nutritive value really in it. I mean, they use straw for bedding or other kinds of things like that, but this was regular first cutting hay, mixed orchard grass hay, orchard grass and timothy hay, that my son had baled and he was selling. This was some leftovers he had from a couple years ago that he hadn't sold. So it was dry and in the barn, and it shook out nicely. The bales were in decent shape. I still have some more in the barn for next year to use, and I just put it on the ground like this. So we'll see what happens. We'll see if I think the onions or the potatoes were any smaller or bigger or healthier or whatever than the traditional way of doing it. And I'll let you know how I make out with that at the end of the year. But I just wanted to share that with you. Again, I didn't invent this. Many other people are doing this in YouTube videos. But I wanted to show you that I gave it a try too. And if this works, hey, think about how much time you could save doing it this way. And I don't know if there are other root crops that you could do this with, maybe like turnips or something like that. I'm not sure. Anything that you'd plant underground. Carrots won't work because you have tiny little carrot seeds, and they have to be planted like 1/4 of an inch below the surface of the soil, so that wouldn't work here. But there might be some other root crops. I just don't plant any other root crops that I can think of at this point to do this with. But if I can get good potatoes and good onions without a whole lot of work, hey, that's wonderful. It's not that they're so expensive I can't afford to buy them, but you know, the more you grow your own food, the better it tastes, right? So thank you for tuning in. Please like and subscribe to our channel. Hit the notifications bell so that we can keep you updated on what we're doing here, country living on a shoestring. And we'll give you further updates as the garden continues to grow. So far, even though we had sort of a late spring, I didn't get this garden in until I think it was the 1st or 2nd of June. Certainly the transplants with the tomato plants and the pepper plants over there in the distance, I didn't. And the seeds as well. I had to replant the beans already because the rabbits got in here and ate most of them off as they were coming up. But we had just this spring that started out wonderfully warm, and then we hit late April and mid-May, and suddenly we're getting frost every night. And so I'm glad I didn't put the tomato plants out or the pepper plants out until after that. Our last frost was here was the night of May 31st into the morning of June 1st. So I'm glad I didn't have them out, because usually I would put my tomatoes out and peppers out maybe, the third week of May if possible, if I want to be early, or at least by Memorial Day. But didn't happen this year, and I'm glad it didn't. So at any rate, this is the lower garden. I'll show you the upper garden a little later. I've got corn and vine crops growing there, and we'll come back to that later. But I just wanted to show you this new way of planting here. It's actually an old way, and it's cheap. It just costs you whatever you're going to plant as far as the onions and the potatoes, and a few bales of hay, which aren't expensive. You can go to any farmer and get some that, you don't have to get the good stuff. Just say, hey, you got some old stuff laying around I can get cheap. Doesn't have to be mushroom hay or anything like that. Just regular hay, regular animal feed hay, and that will provide a nice bed for your crops. So again, thank you for watching, and I'll get back to you with how things turn out.